The air tasted of ionized copper and ruptured alien biology. At the edge of the tree line, something massive shifted in the dark. Varric, a tactical scout for the Qillik mapping unit, stared down at the smooth, heavy river stone resting in the dirt. Beside him, the human named Ezra simply exhaled, reached up and adjusted the brim of his faded canvas hat. The brush parted. The truth is often scrubbed from the official archives to protect morale. You need to hear exactly what happened out there in the dark. Before the records are permanently sealed, stay behind the kinetic shielding, Varric had ordered him. That was 40 standard minutes ago, right before the shielding ceased to exist. The valley was supposed to be a routine cartographic sweep. 6 heavily armed Qillik specialists, accompanied by a single human guide, mapping the high-altitude thermal vents of Sector 4. Ezra walked with a slow, rolling gait, leaning on a walking stick carved from pale wood. He carried no plasma battery, no kinetic dampeners, no tactical optics. To Varric, watching the biometric feed stream across his visor, the human was fragile to the point of absolute absurdity. A localized temperature drop of 10 degrees would induce shivering. A fall from 3 meters could shatter a femur. Then the magnetic inversion hit. It did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with a profound, sickening silence. The squad's heads-up displays flickered from vibrant tactical green to dead black. The low, comforting hum of their kinetic shielding died out instantly. Varric tapped the side of his helmet, a sudden spike of panic flooding his secondary hearts. Nothing. The sector's ambient magnetic field had violently inverted, wiping every localized power cell in the grid. Click. In his hands, his heavy plasma rifle had become a useless block of composite alloy. He squeezed the primary trigger, his digits trembling slightly against the grip. The automated cooling rings on the barrel clicked twice, attempting to cycle a heat sink that had no power to generate heat. The mundane, rhythmic sound of those rings clicking was the only thing anchoring Varric to reality as the gravity of their situation settled over the squad. They were blind, they were deaf to the tactical network, they were completely defenseless, and they were not alone. The first sign was the smell, a rank, acrid odor, like rotting vegetation mixed with raw ozone, drifted down from the upper ridge. Varric's olfactory receptors flared wide. His time sight, a biological trait of the Qillik species that allowed them to perceive probability vectors seconds before they occurred, began to feed him chaotic static field imagery. Shadows detached themselves from the jagged rocks above. They were apex predators, documented in Qillik archives only as Class 9 biological hazards. Quadrupeds with elongated limbs and hyperdense bone plating covering their skulls. They didn't run. They poured over the uneven terrain like liquid oil, their multi-jointed legs absorbing the harsh ground without making a single sound. Formation, Varric hissed, his vocal cords tightening painfully. He signaled with his hands, a primitive gesture he had not used since basic training. Draw ceremonial blades. Lock interlocking fields. It was a death sentence. A Qillik blade against a predator whose hide could deflect low-yield plasma was mathematically absurd. Varric knew it. His squad knew it. His squad knew it. The predators, sensing the sudden drop in electromagnetic defense, clearly knew it too. If they fell back to the ridge, maybe they could force a physical perimeter, maybe they could. A guttural snarl vibrated through the soles of Varric's boots, shattering the thought. 9 of them. 9 massive plated beasts fanned out in a crescent formation, cutting off the descent, their forward-facing eyes locked onto the panicked, shifting Qillik squad. Human, Varric said, his voice dropping into a raspy whisper. There is a narrow fissure 10 meters to your left. Your bone structure may allow you to squeeze inside. Go. Do not look back. Ezra did not move toward the fissure. The human stood planted in the loose shale, his faded canvas jacket flapping gently in the rising wind. He wasn't shaking. His biometrics, which Varric could no longer monitor through a screen but could clearly read in the steady rise and fall of the man's shoulders, were terrifyingly calm. Ezra bent down slowly, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline, and picked up a smooth, heavy river stone from the dirt. "They're pack hunters," Ezra said. His voice was a low rumble, completely devoid of the high-pitched panic that currently flooded the Qillik comms channel. "They flank. You run. They trigger a chase response. You never run from a dog, and you don't run from these. You do not understand the physics of their jaw structure," Varric pleaded. Stepping in front of Ezra, a futile attempt to shield the frail biped. "They will crush your torso in a single bite." Hide. Ezra exhaled a quiet breath. He reached down to his waist, his weathered fingers wrapped around the brass buckle of his braided leather belt. With a smooth, practiced motion, he pulled the pin free and whipped the long leather strap out from his belt loops. Varric stared in utter confusion. The human was disrobing. It was a stress-induced psychological break, a madness brought on by imminent death. Ezra doubled the belt over, creating a pocket in the center. Varric's gaze locked onto that center strap. He noticed a highly specific repetitive wear pattern, a frayed, darkened edge on the braided leather where the human's thumb naturally rested. It was a mark of decades of idle muscle memory friction, not military training, just time. The largest predator let out a deafening roar and lunged down the shale embankment, closing the distance. The massive beast was airborne, a ton of bioplated muscle and serrated bone descending with terrifying predatory grace. Ezra did not cower. He did not brace for the inevitable crushing impact of the creature's jaws. Instead, the older biped stepped forward, leaning directly into the downward angle of the shale. He shifted his weight entirely to his back leg, holding the doubled-over leather strap out to his side. The heavy river stone rested securely in the makeshift pocket formed by the fold. Then, his arm moved. It was not a frantic, panicked thrashing. It was a fluid, terrifyingly precise mechanical sequence. His shoulder rotated, dragging his elbow forward, transferring the kinetic energy down through his wrist and into the long leather strap. The belt spun in a tight vertical arc, blurring into a dark halo beside the human's ear. The rotation lasted for less than a second, but to Varric's hyper-accelerated perception, it felt like an eternity of building tension. The human released one end of the strap. The air simply tore open, a sound like a localized atmospheric breach, a sharp, deafening crack that physically vibrated against Varric's tympanic membranes, shattered the quiet of the valley. Varric instinctively threw his body sideways, tackling his youngest subordinate to the ground. His kinetic memory had interpreted the sound as a high-yield sniper discharge, a hypersonic round, breaking the sound barrier. But there was no energy weapon. There was only the human and the rock. The projectile struck the airborne apex predator squarely in its reinforced cranial plating. The sheer kinetic energy did not merely pierce the thick bone. It completely shattered the creature's forward momentum. The massive beast dropped from the air instantly, collapsing onto the sharp shale like a discarded sack of fluid. Its skull visibly caved inward. Varric pushed himself up from the dirt, his secondary hearts hammering against his ribs in a chaotic rhythm. His biological time sight, desperate to map the new threat vectors, tried to lock onto the human's movements. It fed him nothing but blinding, chaotic static. The biological telemetry calculated the mass at... No, his sensory organs were miscalibrating. How could a frail, aging biped manually generate the required angular velocity to propel an unpowered projectile beyond the speed of sound? Doing so should have ripped the human's own shoulder capsule apart. Yet Ezra stood there, perfectly balanced, his breathing entirely even. The math was terrifyingly simple, yet completely alien to a species that had relied on powered weaponry for millennia. Centripetal force multiplying kinetic energy, concentrated entirely into a single dense point of impact. There were no tracking systems to jam. There were no thermal signatures to mask. There was no electromagnetic frequency to invert. It was a dead, cold rock, transformed into a devastating kinetic warhead by nothing more than leverage and human muscle memory. Pure mechanical devastation, breaking armor that had evolved to withstand plasma burns. The remaining 8 predators skidded to a chaotic halt, their claws digging deep gouges into the loose shale. Their collective hunting instinct was violently interrupted by the instantaneous death of their pack leader. And now, kneeling in the dirt as the smell of ionized copper and ruptured alien biology flooded his olfactory receptors, Varric stared down at that same smooth riverstone. It had rolled to a stop near his boots, slick with dark fluids. Beside him, Ezra simply exhaled, reached up, and adjusted the brim of his faded canvas hat, just as the brush parted again. The alpha replacement, a massive beast with a scarred snout, bared its teeth and stepped from the shadows. Ezra simply bent down, his knees popping audibly in the freezing high-altitude air, and calmly sifted through the loose dirt. He retrieved a second river stone, slightly more jagged than the first, and brushed the excess dust from its surface. He slotted it carefully into the worn leather pocket. "My grandfather used this for deer," Ezra said. His low, steady voice carried over the wind. The sheer, terrifying absurdity of the statement hung heavy over the blood-stained rocks. Varric looked down at his own dead plasma rifle, his thumb idly tracing the useless metal of the cooling rings, a stark, mocking reminder of their absolute reliance on technological superiority. Ezra shifted his weight again, lifting his arm. He didn't even spin the belt this time. He just let it hang loosely from his fingers. The jagged stone rested heavily in the pocket. The predator froze. It let out a low, whimpering sound that Varric had never heard a Class 9 hazard make. Watching the surviving beasts turn and scramble frantically back up the jagged ridge, abandoning their coordinated hunt entirely in the face of a single unarmed biped holding a primitive rock, Varric suddenly understood exactly why human beings had evolved with binocular forward-facing vision. They were not prey. The wider galaxy had simply forgotten what raw mechanical violence looked like when it wasn't filtered through a digital targeting system. The remaining predators crested the upper ridge and vanished into the shadows. The braided leather belt rests today inside a sterile, climate-controlled stasis vault on the third level of the Qillik High Command Evidence Archive. It sits beneath thick, reinforced transparent aluminum, far away from any canvas jackets or mountain winds. Varric still visits it sometimes. He stands alone in the pale fluorescent light, listening to the heavy, dull thud of the lockdown seal engaging behind him, staring at the frayed leather edge where a human thumb once rested.